Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the World Emerging Security Forum. Now we will commence session 3. It's titled The Battle for Technological Dominance, a competition in mineral chips and batteries. And we do have our moderator and speakers on the stage. Please allow me to introduce them. First and foremost, please join me in welcoming Mr. Jin Dong-yuan, Director of China and Asia Security Program at Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and he will be our moderator. Please welcome him with a big round of applause. Thank you. And we have our esteemed panelists. Professor Sofia Kolinchakos, Global Distinguished Professor of Environmental Studies and Public Policy at New York University, Abu Dhabi, is joining us here at the stage. Please welcome her. Thank you. And Mr. Frank Umbach, Head of Research of European Cluster for Climate, Energy, and Resource Security of Center for Advanced Security, Strategic and Integration Studies at University of Bonn, is joining us. Please welcome him. Thank you. And let us welcome Mr. Chunhyuk Bok, a senior researcher at Korea Institute of Geoscience and Mineral Resources. Please welcome him. And we do have Ms. Jainab Usman, Senior Fellow and Director of Africa Program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Let's welcome her. Thank you. And last but not least, please join me in welcoming Ms. Yu Jie, a Senior Research Fellow on China at the Chatham House. Please welcome her. With that, our moderator will now lead the session. Please grab the microphone. You may have the floor.
Yeah, thanks very much. And let me first thank the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for organizing this forum and for the invitation to moderate this panel. So in earlier panels, we were talking, basically discussing the application of technologies. You know, if you think about it, AI, cyber, and whether it's in nuclear or conventional, they are application of critical advanced technologies. For this panel, we're coming down to the basics. You know, basically, we are going back to upstream and midstream in terms of the critical minerals, extraction, refinement, and production. And these critical minerals are very important. I mean, there's a reason they are called critical, because they are essential in many of the commercial devices, electronic devices, EVs, and many applications. You need to have the critical minerals, as well as in many of the military applications there. So obviously, the ongoing U.S.-China sort of a strategic rivalry has cast a shadow over all three of these areas, although I would contend in terms of the batteries, and then even in the areas of critical minerals, there's still space for the two countries, and also between China and the European Union to cooperate, in particular when you think about the green transition and how critical these minerals can play a role. So if we weaponize and politicize and basically create a fierce competition, and then basically create two different parallel ecosystems, which will not be good, and you can have a self-fulfilling prophecy. And the reason when China sees the US is imposing lots of restrictions, you know, the Biden administration already 3 or 4 times and placing hundreds of Chinese chip-making companies on the blacklist or entity list. And the US also is strong arming the Netherlands, ASML, and Japanese chip-making equipment factories to also toe the line in a sense. So we see just early this week, China retaliated by imposing export controls on several of these critical minerals. So basically, you'll have a tit for tat. With Trump coming to office in January, and he has already indicated cross-board 60% tariffs. And on the critical, maybe chips and some chips equipment, making equipment, I would assume that Trump will continue the policy of the Biden administration, which in turn continue the Trump administration policy back in 2018 and 2019. Now, there are several reasons why China today is a dominant player in quite a few of these critical minerals. Of course, number one, there's a whole of government strategic planning for years. So China already way back in the 2 decades ago already identified certain sectors to make the investment and then just even at great cost and perhaps environmental pollution and all of that. So, but China realized these would be the sectors that would be very critical. At the same time, I think the same can be said because of the regulatory frameworks in the OECD country, in the US, in Europe, which were not welcoming the, such distraction of critical minerals because of the environmental problems there. So now we have this situation, both the critical minerals and the chips, the United States and China in serious competition, which also affects many of the other players, the European Union, several of the Indo-Pacific countries such as Japan, Republic of Korea. So if this intensified competition continues, I think we will be in a really, really bad situation where we'll basically it's not a win-win situation, it's a lose and lose kind of environment. So we have an excellent panel of experts to address some of these questions in the context of these broad frames. So let me maybe start the question with, let me see, with Sophia. And of course, you have written extensively about China's involvement in the critical mineral development. You also note this competition between China and the US. And there is a perception and perhaps to some extent reality of the US and some of the European countries and Asian countries. They depend on China on the critical minerals supplies. So therefore, in this competitive environment, there are growing concern about supply chain resilience, concern about maybe China can use its dominant position to coerce the recipient countries, or when it is being punished in one way, perhaps China will retaliate in kind. And so the economic relations, which have been very mutually beneficial over the decades, now increasingly be negatively affected, including, I think, perhaps we may lose the bigger picture of where benefits can be gained, for instance, in the green transition. So cooperation would be very much preferred than the competition or restriction. In some areas, I can understand, high advanced chips, of course. But in the legacy memory chips and lower end, now the US is basically expanding the scope, even in those 28 nanometers kind of a legacy memory chips making areas. So basically, the question would be, can you see we are not being able to get out of this situation, and then so cooperation is completely out of the picture.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Korea for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to address everyone. It's my first time in your country, and I have to say I have only great things to say about my stay and my experience. I'd like to cut to the chase in some way and maybe lower the realist volume. Because all day long we've been hearing about security and threats and defining security in a way that is, I would say, almost aggressive. We've created this frame where we're almost stuck in a situation from which I'm now asked, well, is there any hope to achieve some kind of collaboration, at least in the name of the green transition? And as I tell my students in the university, because I know there are a lot of young people here who actually would like to hear some hopeful, also they need to know the challenges, but also try to find a hopeful narrative out of this, is that the elephant in the room is the Sino-US bipolar competition. This was not a given. This is something that we've arrived at. So we're going to talk about that on the side. But I want to start by saying the green transition, what is it? Most people can't exactly define it. But it's a decision that we all came together as a world community in 2015 after Paris, that in order to respond to the climate crisis, we need to keep the temperature from rising above 2 degrees Celsius, 1.5 if we're lucky. This transition, as it was articulated, was mainly focused on reducing emissions in the energy sector and in transportation. It meant the electrification of transport. It meant the deployment of renewables. Now, all of these, this is an industrial plan. And the question of competition under the previous years, let's say, before we arrived at this bipolar hyper-competition that we're now experiencing, this was a trade issue. When I wrote the book about China and the geopolitics of rare earths in the ancient year of 2018, and I said, how have we all agreed to transition our entire infrastructures and our economies into this direction in the name of the planet and the climate? How is it that we're doing this without making sure that we have access to all of these materials? And those people who were economists believed that the market provided all of the solutions. Today, we've woken up to the reality that geopolitics trump economics. We've gotten, of course, to the point now where geopolitics are so contentious that we're finding it impossible to identify areas of cooperation. So I'd like to also add that even the digital transition, which was going to happen anyway because when there's a technological capacity, we embark on it, part of the dematerialization of the economy was again for climate reasons. And this too now has become an area of hyper-competition, of different norms and values, of different ways of understanding rights, who's in control, state or private companies, what is freedom, walls or barriers. So I just want to say, I guess I'm going to get around to it in the second round because I'm looking at the timer. But I want us all to remember that what's happening today is that the geopolitics, in an effort perhaps to avoid all-out war and conflict, is really centering around economic disputes, which is why things that were confined to trade relations and ties of interdependence, our entire global supply chains, were created so that they made economic sense. Today, we're fighting our battles there, and this is not a good outcome for the climate for sure, for the planet, and for also to give us opportunities to find ways to create trust. We heard a lot about this from the previous panels. How do we create trust? How do we involve stakeholders? How do we bridge the divides between the global north and the global south? We have promised these things to the developing world as we transition into the green economy, and these are areas that we need to focus on. I guess I'll stop here for now and get back to it.
Yeah, thanks, Sophia. I now turn to Frank. And so, of course, Europe is also very dependent on critical minerals and perhaps also chips, because it only produces about 10% of the chips it needs. So recognizing this may create or cause vulnerability because of the reliance on a few suppliers. And what are Europe's strategies in the last few years, even before Wonderland talked about de-risking? So what have these strategies been for mitigating the risk and challenges? For instance, the access to and investment in critical minerals, extraction, refinement, and production. And to what extent this has been coordinated, or these have been coordinated with the U.S., knowing that, since the Biden administration, there's TPC, their transatlantic trade and what is the C in your committee there. So how is that the transatlantic cooperation, and do you think so far it has yielded better result, or they are still bickering over terms and terms of trade, even between Europe and the U.S.?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, let me also thank the South Korean Foreign Ministry for having invited me here. Let me make at first maybe a little bit of a critical note to the discussion we have witnessed so far, also as someone who is working normally on cybersecurity and a number of other security issues. I think what we heard up today, these discussions are very worthwhile, very balanced, very informative. But when it comes to international cooperation and collaboration, I still have the feeling that we live sometimes on a different kind of planet. Because the geopolitical landscape have dramatically changed, much more than we are probably willing to recognize up to now. When it comes to transparency and collaboration, I think we have to recognize we have to do here within axis of upheaval of countries which have openly challenging the rule-based world order. We just need to listen what presidents like Xi Jinping, Putin, and others are saying. They have argued for years to change their own national borders or expand their geopolitical leverage. We are, as I said, we are still obviously unwilling to recognize these changes. That brings me to my topic, and let me also highlight, or beginning some remarks to the global developments and global demand growth. We have already heard by Sophia that the faster the global energy transition should go in terms of achieving the climate targets, the higher the critical raw demand will be globally. And I'll give you just one example, which is very strikingly making clear what we are talking about. Copper. Copper is needed for the global expansion, for the digitalization and modernization of the electrical grids around the world. This is an issue which has been greatly underestimated by all kinds of national, international energy plans up to now. At the same time, the cost factor of modernizing the grid had been undermined, as well as the demand of critical raw materials. One of a more new analysis recently concluded that the future copper demand, just for modernizing, digitalizing the electrical grids around the world over the next 2-3 decades, will be higher than the total copper production in history has ever been up to now. And if you think upon that, from the planning to the operation of a mine lies a time frame of internationally, in average, of 7 to 10 years. In Western countries, often 15 to 20 years. And what that means also for investors who don't know, when they want to invest in lithium mines today, whether the lithium would be needed in 10, 15 years, maybe for a new kind of a new battery generation, which will no longer be based on lithium. That boils down that not enough investments are used today for investing in international mines because of the uncertainties and the rapid speed of new technologies, even in the field, for example, of batteries. Another factor is the geopolitical factor here. China, for a long time, since at least 2015, and Xi Jinping has argued or openly argued repeatedly by saying that China needs to decrease its technological and overall dependencies on the West. And at the same time, he has said that China needs to increase the Western dependencies on China. When you're looking to the trade imbalance over the last 5-10 years, which have increased in the case of the EU as well as of the US between exports and imports, then you can argue that this imbalance of the trade development exactly confirms what he has said for years. And that boils down to the issue of our overdependencies on the imports of critical raw materials from China or of refined and reprocessed products. And for a long time, we have overlooked that our dependencies on the refining and the reprocessing capacities of China are even higher than from Chinese mines, be it in China or being controlled by China internationally. That brings me to the European policies and the European Commission. The European Commission has been working on critical raw material supply security since 2008. But for a long time, supply security issues, when they had been addressed in conferences, had been completely separated from discussions on energy security. So it had been not linked with renewables, with electrolysis, for example, which you need for green hydrogen, etc. It was only the World Bank in a publication of 2017 which linked supply security to the issue of energy security, of future concepts of energy security, and linked it to renewables and the green energy transition. The European Commission back in 2010 and countries such as Germany have developed a 3-pillar strategy. The first pillar refers to the demand management and efforts to decrease the demand growth. The second pillar was favoring the domestic European mining, meanwhile also refining and reprocessing capacities. And the third pillar was referring to the need of recycling, reuse, and developing alternative critical or using alternative critical raw materials which do not create so many supply security risks. The EU in this year adopted the so-called Critical Raw Materials Act, which defines clear targets also for European mining, etc. And you can question that, whether that's realistic to implement by the year 2030. So as a European, I would argue we do not have a fundamental problem in recognizing the challenges or defining those challenges on the paper, even not by defining adequate strategies in coping with the manifold challenges we face. But we do have a huge problem in bridging the gap between our declaratory policies and implementing those recommendations, because we are too slow, we are too bureaucratic, lengthy processes, and there is a lack of political will, both on the governmental side and very often also in the industry side. And how to bridge that gap is the major challenges in the years ahead. To the perspective of transatlantic cooperation, I think we need to remind ourselves we started back in 2012, and that was 2 years after the Japanese-Chinese conflict about the Chinese exports of rare earths to Japan. 2 years later, a trilateral cooperation had started between the US, EU, and Japan. Meanwhile, extended, including Australia, Canada, as well as the G7 countries. During the first Trump administration, that was one of the very few areas, actually, where the cooperation between the EU and the United States worked very well, because we defined our common interests in this field in quite in the same way. And that facilitated actually and fastened and deepened even the transatlantic cooperation on supply security of critical raw materials. Of course, in the US, since 2015, critical raw materials had been also defined as a security issue, put it on the security agenda because the Pentagon recognized to which extent it was dependent on the import of critical raw materials for its high-tech weaponry. Sometimes a little bit surprising, but the US debate started not on the side of the Pentagon, but actually by academic experts in the US Congress, by highlighting even the Pentagon, the arms industry's dependence on China. In Europe, we have the same problem. We just discovered in our defense industry following the pandemic years and the disruption of supply chains, and as well as alongside of the Ukraine conflict, to which extent our arms industry is dependent on the imports of critical raw materials. Just give you one example, which was also surprising me, which came out this year. So for the production of explosive or ammunition, you need to import the shooting cotton, for example, which we don't have. Actually, we completely, or 80%, we completely import that from China. Yeah, at a times when we want to raise our defense budget and to build more armament to make our armed forces, as the German defense minister said, ready for war. And you can't do that without these critical raw materials. So here again, I would argue this is an area where I still have some hopes that despite the dangers and risk of a trade conflict which could easily emerge between Trump administration and the EU, this is certainly one of the areas where I still see that strategic interest may define a common policy also in the years ahead, and that's very, very important if we want to de-risk our overdependence on China and to build up more resilient supply chains, which is also an issue, meanwhile, for our industrial competitiveness, which will be, in the years ahead, the most important, probably the most important technological issue at a time when the European Commission and the European Parliament has been completely changed in recent years, where we have seen in the first half of the year that funds from the climate and the energy sector have been shifted, redefined to security and defense, and that will continue in the years ahead. And our industrial policies, industrial competitiveness, and what we never had in the past, our overall economic security strategy, a little bit model following the Japanese model, that will be something which will play an ever more important role in the years to come.
Okay, thanks, Frank. I think you've raised two critical points. One is you refer to China's recognition that it would not want to depend on other countries for its advanced technology. So therefore, this Made in China 2025. And also before that, even in the late 90s, in the mid 80s, already even major projects to advance technologies. And so the government put in enormous resources. The second point is, I think also is important, you mentioned that there's a desire or there's some wish to do something, but how to implement, so that's a important question because Australia is a country of alternative critical minerals. But when you look at Australia, what the Australian government has done is basically, okay, we'll provide $7 billion in credit line, and then here a few million dollars here, a few millions there. So it's way, not enough to really. And also President Biden's recent visit to Angola, so he promised $1 billion. When you think of what China has invested over the last 25 years, it's $25 billion. So if you want to do something, and you really need to not just make the commitment, but also make the investment there. So with that, we move on to Jung-kyu. So I think you are perhaps the expert in the sort of mineral mining or engineer in that area. So the questions, now there are quite a few proposals and action plans to have alternative kind of a supply of critical minerals. How quickly and how affordable these alternative critical minerals can be, extracted and refined and manufactured? What would be some of the challenges you can see, and how that overall, I mean, on the supply chain security, that is also your areas of specialty. Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me this esteemed conference, and it's a great honor to get an opportunity to talk about the very, very important topic. To answer this, our moderator's question, I'd like to talk about what is like a critical minerals and why it is important. Because basically, the critical mineral is it's a non-alternative in near future, and it's very critical to our economic security. As our moderator mentioned, the demand for critical mineral was driven by green energy policies, and now advancement in battery and AI technology are adding even greater pressure to meet this demand for these critical minerals. The definition of a critical mineral are commodities found in a wide variety of ore deposits that are vital to economic and national security of individual nations that are vulnerable to supply disruption. It is provided by USGS. The clean energy relies heavily on electricity, including technologies like electric vehicles and renewable energy. This requires significant amount of battery minerals and rare metals for permanent magnets and semiconductors. For example, a single EV needs about 5 times more minerals than traditional internal combustion engine vehicle because it has a very big size of a battery. To put this into perspective, your iPhone contains only 6 grams of lithium, but EV car battery holds 6 kilograms of lithium. It's 1,000 times bigger. But this surge in demand alone doesn't fully explain the supply chain security risk. The real challenges lie on the supply side. Before the 2020s, critical mineral wasn't key players in the mineral markets. The focus was on base metal like copper, aluminum, or iron ore. Critical minerals were either produced in small volume or as byproducts with no advanced production technologies or established market to support their development. The world, excluding China, has not adequately prepared to produce the critical minerals needed to meet this skyrocketing demand. Over the past half century, globalization has shifted low-level manufacturing capabilities to developing countries, while developed nations have focused on fostering higher value-added industry. Thus, combined with a biased distribution of mineral resources has made the mineral supply chain increasingly unbalanced. Today, China dominates all stages of a critical mineral supply chain. China's dominance is the most pronounced in the midstream stage, and Chinese state-owned enterprise actively acquire upstream projects worldwide. For example, China dominates the 77% of graphite upstream and 99% of graphite midstream and 93% of graphite downstream. Also, for semiconductor minerals, China dominates 98% of gallium production and more than 2/3 of germanium production. These high concentrations significantly increase the risk within the critical mineral supply chain. So, in this response, many countries propose the security measures or security mechanisms from last year. For example, Australia has a very good structured system, and also South Korea announced the security measures last year. These security mechanisms can largely be divided into short-term strategy and long-term strategies. The short-term strategy includes the measures such as stockpiling, offtake agreement, bilateral international cooperation, and government incentives. A long-term strategy involves the multilateral cooperation frameworks, developing the resilient system to respond to supply disruption, and advancing technological development. There are two main goals. The first one is scaling up the production, and second one is the diversification. And the one more thing is the responsible and sustainable development. And let me talk about the scaling up the production. The biggest challenge in scaling up production lies in the fact that mining and processing projects requires significant capital and long lead time. From the supply chain perspective, it's ideal to encourage demanding companies to invest directly in these projects. For example, automakers can enter the refining and mining sector to build a more stable supply chain through direct investment or offtake agreement. That is called vertical integration. Actually, Tesla already made a good case, and they reduced the operating costs dramatically. However, many uncertainties make it difficult to push this investment. One of the biggest obstacles is a long timeline required to ramping up the project. This is where we see distinct contrasts between China and other regions. In China, it typically takes 3 to 5 years to bring the mining project from initiation to production. In contrast, in Canada, the United States, and Europe, this process often exceeds 10 years. sometimes stretching beyond more than 15 years. To address this, we urgently need to streamline permitting process and improving efficiency by fostering better coordination among stakeholders. One thing we have to think about it is stockpiling. The stockpiling is the one of a very important issue now talking in the multilateral body. While most measures need to be led by a private sector, stockpiling is an area where the government can play a larger role. In the case of oil and gas, the 90 days of mandatory stockpiling requirement for IEA members countries has helped establish the supply stability following the oil shocks. For minerals, however, the diversity of minerals, as well as complex industrial and production situation in different countries, make it difficult to apply the same mechanism as oil. Nevertheless, stockpiling critical mineral can help sustain production during short-term supply chain disruption and provide time to explore alternative source of imports. Moreover, the fact that there are stockpiles in the mineral market can significantly alleviate the emergence of speculative forces and reduce market anxiety. Now, only a few countries are doing this mineral stockpiling: Korea, Japan, and the United States. The United States only doing for defense purpose. In the long term, technological development is the most critical factor. For instance, the development of a fracking and AI application in shale gas demonstrates how technological advancements can rapidly increase production. Efficient exploration and production technologies like smart mining, raw material substitution technology, eco-friendly development technology, and recycling technology are all essential. However, what must be considered here is need to establish a roadmap for each type of mineral, identifying which technologies can be utilized and what technology gaps exist. The targeted investment in research and development should be made accordingly. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Let's move on to Sanap. So I think with the attention to critical minerals, the African continent suddenly has become the focus of great powers scrambling for a place to gain access to resources and to invest in extraction and perhaps even refinement there. So if you could give a general picture, so obviously China and the US are the two key players, and the EU may be another key player there as well. So what are some of the characteristics of their sort of scrambling or trying to secure a place of critical minerals? And which ones do you think have been so far more effective in meeting the goals as stated by either Beijing or Washington?
Well, thank you very much to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for inviting me to this distinguished conference, and this also a very nice high-tech setup. I've been taking a lot of pictures, very bright, very colorful. Very nice food as well. This is a very crucial topic, very important. I think for a lot of African countries, it's also not a new issue. The question of how to harness natural resources more generally, but also mineral resources more specifically for economic development, for improved well-being, for increased prosperity is not a new one. The engagement and interaction between African countries and the rest of the world with respect to natural resources is also not a new phenomenon. In fact, some would argue that the very nature of the incorporation of the entire African continent into the global economy was on the basis of a very asymmetrical relationship with respect to natural resources, and we can go into details on that. This happened over centuries. So this is not a new issue at all. It seems, however, that there's a new scramble for minerals and metals, critical minerals as they are called. I prefer to use the term transition minerals or strategic minerals, because critical minerals, the definitions are very temporal, they change over time. They're sometimes geographical in nature. Critical minerals in the US, the list is very different from that of Korea, from that of the UK, etc. So what I want to do right now is just to talk about the range of industrial policies, trade policies, and investment initiatives that are being pursued and implemented by both consuming countries for these minerals and metals, but also by producer countries, including those in Africa. And in both cases, both the consuming countries and the producer countries, they're all trying to either secure supply chains, de-risk supply chains, diversify sources of supplies, and they are trying to capture the benefits of these resources in terms of revenues, in terms of productivity gains, in terms of market share of production. So that really is what we're working with. And also within this context, before I talk about the three things, we are at a unique period in time in which the scope for multilateral action is quite narrow. Multilateralism is withering, as some would argue. In fact, for this particular issue, we don't, I would argue, have very effective multilateral initiatives. The most recent, most recent attempt at having an effective, up-to-date multilateral initiative is the UN Secretary General's panel on critical minerals that was convened a couple of months ago, and they came out with their report in September. But otherwise, we really don't have effective multilateral initiatives. So starting with the the industrial policy tools. And the context here is that we know the demand side of the equation, where the demand also has specific geographical characteristics, a lot of it coming from, of course, the US, Europe, but also very importantly, China and a number of global powers, perhaps including South Korea, where a lot of the innovations, a lot of the production and the manufacturing is happening. But on the supply side of the equation, these minerals and metals, the endowments, they are actually spread across a variety of jurisdictions in Asia, in Latin America, in the Middle East, but also in Africa. And this is a whole range of countries. Some are low income, some are middle income, some are high income, some are very politically unstable. In high income jurisdictions, actually, the key issue is that a lot of communities don't want mining to happen. I think about Serbia and the Jadar lithium project, where, despite having a lot of promise, communities and political opposition, they have decided that they do not want mining, and sometimes people do have a reason for that. The environmental devastation can be quite significant. But then, going into the industrial policy dimension of things, a lot of the consuming countries are able to implement industrial policies. They have the resources, be it, generous subsidies, generous tax incentives, and we've heard of Made in China 2025, which has really enabled China to dominate entire segments of mineral value chains. But also in the US, industrial policy has taken the form of legislation passed within the last couple of years, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And in fact, for the first time in to be honest, in my lifetime, US government officials are proudly talking about industrial policy. Like, I'm old enough to remember that just a few years ago, if you said industrial policy in certain circles, you would be hounded out of town. Like, it was heresy to mention industrial policy. So industrial policies are being pursued, but this is really the prerogative of wealthy countries. A lot of low and middle income countries cannot afford to pursue industrial policies. The other, this then brings me to the second set of policy tools that we see being used, trade policy tools and instruments. And in fact, I would argue that trade policy is arguably one of the most important things we all have to grapple with right now. Again, you can see certain distinctions between the producer countries and the consuming countries. So with respect to the consuming countries, again, the wealthy countries, the US, China, parts of the EU, etc. Tariffs are being used, and in the case of the US, in the Inflation Reduction Act, there are clear like indirect tariffs in a sense where the tax incentives are only applicable to companies that are able to use minerals that are sourced from countries that have a free trade agreement with the US. That's a long-winded way of saying if you don't have a free trade agreement with the US, then the company that sources inputs from that country would not be able to benefit from the generous tax benefits, tax incentives. I mean, same with China. China has had a variety of tariffs over the years. But what we're also seeing, especially with respect to the consuming countries, the producer countries, I think about Indonesia here, a lot of African countries like Tanzania, Ghana, Zimbabwe, a lot of them are using export bans. Indonesia was able to effectively use a variety of export bans over, a 14, 15-year period, especially with respect to nickel. And, depending on who you talk to, people have very strong views about export bans used in Indonesia. Some are like, this was a terrible thing to do. Some think it's like the best thing since sliced bread. But nevertheless, Indonesia has been able to capture the nickel, that is the refining and midstream segment of the nickel value chain. And I think it controls about over 50% of global refining for nickel. And we're seeing a number of African countries also impose export bans. The third set of instruments that we see being used, of course, in the US, in China, but also far afield, including the GCC countries, so Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, which are now becoming very important players with respect to critical minerals, is a variety of investment initiatives, investment strategies, investment partnerships, and including South Korea. In fact, South Korea hosted a Korea-Africa summit earlier this year, and critical minerals was quite central to that entire summit. Over 25 African heads of states in attendance, with a number of initiatives announced. So those are, I think, the three key policy instruments that we see being used, and a lot of them tend to be bilateral. But for now, I think we're really lacking in effective multilateral initiatives and mechanisms. I'm going to stop there.
Yeah. Thanks very much. So we now move to Dr. Yu Jie. I'm sure, Europeans are talking, have been talking de-risking in the last few years, and actually we produced a report comparing EU and Japanese de-risking policies. So what is your sense of Brussels and with regard to dealing with China in the critical mineral chips and all of that? My sense is that even though Brussels recognizes our risks and they have vulnerabilities, it is not very keen on engaging in a very comprehensive across the board kind of a competition with China. And where possible, I think there still is hope that the European Union and China can collaborate and cooperate in areas, the green transition, where their collaboration would, not only benefit the two key players, but also, climate action and the whole transition in a post-fossil fuel kind of economy.
Well, thank you, Dr. Yuan. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Again, let me echo my colleague said in here. Thanks so much for Korean Foreign Ministry as well as CIPRI to putting this excellent and timely event together and for this very Instagram-friendly stage as well. Now, Dr. Yuan, to answer your question, I think perhaps I'm going to offer quite pessimistic assessment in here regarding this potential collaboration between Brussels and Beijing, and also major EU member states with Beijing in here. I think there's 3 reasons in here. First reason in here is actually the structural economic reason. So in the past, I would say in the past 2 decades or so, that one thing which Beijing is trying to do is really trying to upgrading its manufacturing capability, and by using a very heavy-handed, strong industrial policies to upgrading its value of export. So this actually put the Chinese manufacturing products, irrespective is on EV or irrespective is on renewable energy equipment and so on and so forth, into a direct competition with European counterparts. So the sense of complementarity on the economics between EU and China has not gone. And I see this as being a structural issue, that is to say, President Xi does not want its economy totally be dependent on property sector, but instead, what he wants to do is he wants to build China in a much larger size of Germany, of being that global manufacturing powerhouse. So that will put in a structural economic challenge, number 1, together with European Union. So that would make collaboration and cooperation very difficult. And irrespective of the government subsidies or the Chinese companies went through a very much cutting-throat competition domestically and led into the result. Now we have the champion of BYD and various, and MG Rover, for example, even though it's a British brand, but it's owned by Shanghai Automotive. So that structural economic reason hindered collaboration. Now the second reason is deeply entrenched in the political ideology and also for the current geopolitical bifurcation we have in here. I think really after the round of COVID, as well as Russia's invasion towards Ukraine, many European leaders and European political elites considering whether they can have to put in all the eggs in one basket. So energy depended on Russia and then manufacturing depended on China. So that is very much a reckoning moment from the Europeans. And equally, I think really from the Chinese perspective, and how they look into the world. And they realize perhaps we have to pursue that sense of technology and economic self-reliance in order to make sure its economy will be waterproof from perhaps even the worst geopolitical outcomes, that sense of US containment strategy, and also that building very strong alliances between the United States and Europe, and in terms of containing China. So I think that really deeply entrenched political reasoning here also hindered the cooperation on green transitions, on various other things. And also the Chinese has its own complaint by saying, in the past, and European Union has been the champion of climate change and hoping the other countries will be able to collaborate together with the EU. And now, given that China made some contribution on carbon reduction and also over EVs and renewable, and because of Chinese very strong competition, and make Europeans realize they should have to building some sense of trade fortress in order not having too many Chinese products flooded into the European market. So I think that economic and political reason in here have hindered the collaboration. Now the third reason is to the rest of the world. So we spoke quite a lot earlier in the 2 sessions about China and the West, about this bifurcated global great power competition. But I think really for the rest of the world, and China already made the case through whether it's the Belt and Road Initiative, whether it's on the Global Development Initiative, that building very strong network of climate change agenda, offering renewable energy equipment and building infrastructures among many of the non-Western countries. So that sense of presenting the narrative that China has been a responsible force on climate change have been made among the global South countries. I'm sure many in here would be disagree with me, which is fine. But unfortunately, I think that's what China has been pursuing in the last decade or so, in the absence of United States and European Union. So that really leads into the sense that if we're talking about collaboration on climate change, on current transition with China, I think China will be more putting inclined to collaborating with the global south rather than with the global north. And that, again, leads us in a more divided world over here. And also, I think now the role of global south within China's own economic diplomacy, within China's own framework of upgrading its industrial capacity or manufacturing capacity, has also been shifted from merely really a source of demand for critical minerals, demand for raw materials, and transfer into a much larger market for China. And I think that's also partially to do with the trade war, and that's also partially to do with China's much strained relationship with the European Union. So again, I think the picture is quite zigzag in here and not something quite straightforward. If we're talking about collaboration, I think the prospect of collaboration for China is much greater with non-Western countries and less so in the part of the global north.
Yeah, thanks. Clearly, I've not been a disciplining moderator, so we almost run out of time there. So, but I will ask maybe two related questions. So when we talk about all these minerals, chips, and all of these, and policies and risk, de-risking, we assume as if the public sector, the government can just say, oh, we see the problem, let's do something. But the fact of the matter is that many of the critical mineral extraction, refinement, many of these are carried out by private enterprises, right? So they make investment, and then they take the risk. And so they would like to, of course, to have government support in regular term, but even better, maybe subsidies there. So how do you see there can be private and public partnership in managing and mitigating the challenges of in the areas of critical minerals, and also your kind of I don't know, the projecting of strategic foresight kind of a view of in the next 5 years, do you think it's going to get even worse, or it can be some guardrail can be put in place, and so at least we have more kind of a disciplined competition there? Yeah, so Sophia, yeah.
So I think you got a very well-rounded view of the supply chains, of the problems of the different regions and their approaches, the different jurisdictions and how they've dealt with critical minerals, and the supply chains and the transition. And I think this is a great question. The first thing I wanted to pinpoint is, as you can understand from this entire presentation, part of the problem that we've had is that the OECD countries, the usual suspects, the major industrial powers, had really lost a lot of time in terms of building the green transition and securing both the infrastructure and the tech for the digital transition. And I think China had decided to leapfrog in a space where it couldn't compete in terms of, for example, electric vehicles. It was the first to really put in so much investment, so much of an effort. China put in subsidies, they used industrial policy, it was very aggressive, it wanted to build its economy. Sometimes the way we talk about it is as if it did something terrible, whereas the OECD countries have been doing this for years and decades, and this is why they've been able to lead. The question is, here we are today. With all of these problems that we have, I always want to remind us of the climate transition, because the electric vehicles have been, and renewables are solutions to reduce carbon emissions. We have a deadline, which is 2030. It's right around the corner in order for us to make the shift. Now, in terms of the private sector, who influences whom? The private sector government, or government the private sector? What we have seen in the story of critical minerals is that the private sector went for the bottom line. Even after the 2010 rare earth crisis, as soon as the prices corrected themselves and the unofficial embargo to Japan was over, yes, we had tripartite agreements between Japan, the EU, and the US. They were really trying to reduce the use of rare earths into certain applications. They were looking for new scientific ways to substitute, and they talked a lot about recycling. But what had not happened is the realization that they were utterly dependent on China and China's supply chains for the entire new industrial transition that they had all agreed upon to embark. Now, the private sector, I'd like to say, has never been the leader here. The private sector is expecting the taxpayer to fund, via the government, to fund the basic infrastructures for these transitions. This is why in the United States, we have the IRA Act. These are all subsidies. Subsidies for an American to buy an electric vehicle. Subsidies for Detroit to produce an electric vehicle. The problem that OECD countries are realizing is that China has product, they do not have product. This is why they're slapping all of these tariffs on China. We do not, in Europe, have electric vehicles to sell anybody at an affordable price. China has broken the code. China has done the same with renewables. Did it do it justly? Did it do it by, I don't know, avoiding perhaps using industrial policy excessively, using state companies, state funding? Yes. Why? Because the West was very much beholden to globalization. And now the pendulum has swung to the other side, where we believe in breaking ties of interdependence or building new ties of interdependence with our allies. Except here's I guess, what we need to remember, that the United States, who is the other part of the bipolar power structure, we do not know how the United States is going to react under Trump too. And that is to say that at least under the Biden administration, there was a Made in America policy for the green and digital transitions. Yes, the allies were excluded. Yes, oftentimes the United States is pushing Korea, for instance, to come and establish foundries and bring their tech into the United States and also pay for it. But the reality was that there at least was a transatlantic and global collaboration between the US and its allies. This may not be the same story after January 20th, because as we've seen, tariffs were announced for Mexico, Canada, and China. And in fact, Canada and Mexico were offered higher tariffs, who are the neighbors and allies. So we have to wait and see what's going to happen. If it's going to be that for allies, it will be a quid pro quo. This is important. It did not used to be this way. So let's say ideologically Brussels is upset with China because it's realized that there's a trade imbalance and they need to also be able to produce cars. But they're going to have to find a way to work with China if, for example, the transatlantic relationship becomes very fraught. And there is an opportunity through climate, I think this was this was correct, through relations with the developing world, for Europe and China, who never really left the developing world, to build the kinds of bridges of collaboration. I mean, it's geopolitics and politics. I'm not saying that they're the best of actors. I'm not saying that they don't have their own agendas. But at least I think, because of the Belt and Road, and because of Global Gateway, and because of the regional connectivity of Eurasia and Africa, at the very least, this is a place where at least Europe, if it has to, may be able to lean toward bringing China to the discussion table as a regulatory power and a standard and norm and standard-making power. So I am hopeful in this respect. I'm not saying that this will all happen. Geopolitically, I think it's advantageous because the reality is most of the countries don't want to live in a bipolar world. They want to be able to trade with everyone. I mean, Europe and the United States have embargoed Russia, And the UAE is trading with Russia. India is trading with Russia. Other countries are trading. So we're not living in the 1990s and the 2000s. This is a very different place where there are new regional actors, where there are new regional powers, where countries are trying to hedge. They like democracy or the protection of the United States in certain levels, but they also really enjoy having economic relations that benefit their people, their development. One last word about this, that China also, and I think you were right to mention that, China comes with a vision, even if, again, we can seriously criticize it. You cannot have a geopolitical leadership today without having the climate crisis at the center. And China comes with ecological civilization, which is really a developmentalist vision for a sustainable sort of development. Europe, too, has its own vision, which is living well within the planetary boundaries. The point being that there can be no further leadership in this world without climate leadership, because even if we want to go to war or compete in cyberspace or compete elsewhere, the climate is catching up with us. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we have 1 minute, 90 seconds. So instead of maybe 30 seconds of your crystal ball, can Europe compete and address the vulnerability issues in the critical minerals?
Firstly, I'm still not sure whether we really understand China's geoeconomic and geopolitical policies. I think China has declared, actually, of fully control the supply chains of the most important disruptive green technologies. Yeah, from the very beginning, which means the extraction of minerals up to refinement, reprocessing, up to the end products. And it's in contrast to the past, it's already in a very strong position. When you're looking to the present discussion of EV exports to the European market and the oversupplies on the Chinese one, it's very often portrayed this is the result of management failures in China, it's a result of the declining domestic consumption. That's actually not. It's a deliberate strategy. You could see that going back to the rare earth debate we had in the 1980s, 1990s, when the mountain mine in the US was the biggest rare earth mine in the world. And then the Chinese expanded the production to the point where almost all the Western companies went out of the global market because it was not profitable any longer. At the very end, China dominated the rare earth market until 2010, at the point of the conflict with Japan, where 97% of the global production of rare earths was taking place in China. And the oversupplies today are also a deliberate strategy, yeah, of pushing out, of destroying the Western companies on the global markets, yeah, and so the challenge is actually much bigger than we often realize. And our problems also have a lot to do with an increasing conflict of competing strategic interests on our side. Yeah, which the governments don't like to talk about. On one hand, we want to fasten the green energy transition for climate reasons. On the other hand, we want to rebuild, reshore, and de-risk our over-dependencies on China. So we have to make a choice here, and we cannot both have it. Yeah, either you can go ahead with fastening the energy transition, then you need to import even more solar cells. Even 40% of the green hydrogen production of electrolysis is already taking place in China. So you have to rely on even more imports on green technologies from China. Or you want to rebuild, reshore capacities at home, and then this is a cost factor. It makes the products more costly. And in times when we face even more financial constraints, yeah, then of course governments need to define very clear priorities. Yeah, But at the very end, when you want to de-risk, when you want to reshore capacities at home, then it's a cost issue, and then it will slow down the green energy transition. And governments and industries have to make a choice here and to communicate that very, very clearly to their own population.
Yeah, given the, I think the time sensitivity, perhaps really 30 seconds, Dr. Park.
Okay, let me talk about a little bit about the example of a private and public partnership of a Korean case. Let me go very quickly. We have three cases. First one is we are doing a technological support by state-owned companies or national lab, because there's only a few experts in consuming countries, so the experts in the government side should support the reading and verify the feasibility study report. And the second one is this year we made a very big public finance support. The name is the Supply Chain Stabilization Fund, and it's almost $8 billion annually, and it's a types of a loan and provide to a company who can build like a critical mineral supply chain. And the third one is the government can support the international cooperation as the bilateral form, because the government controls like many types of mining rights and mining claims. So it's very effective to do something by a government. Is very helpful to private sector. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, really 30 seconds, no more than 45. Yeah. Go ahead.
So I want to take the question on the private sector. It's also worth reiterating and remembering that the landscape of investors and actors in the mining space is changing. For the longest time, the biggest mining companies, the mining majors as they're called, were, and to an extent they still are, European companies, Canadian companies, Australian companies. There are a few American companies, not many, but it's largely a European affair. In the case of Africa in particular, a lot of upstream activity is mostly dominated by European companies, with very little refining and processing happening. In fact, this back and forth discussion with companies has been going on for decades, and you would get the same response: oh, there's no infrastructure, there's corruption, processing cannot happen, it's not cost effective, it's not feasible, etc., etc. And that's partly why Indonesia imposed the ban. So there's that, but we increasingly have the second set of actors, which is the state-owned enterprises and quasi-state-owned enterprises. And a lot of those increasingly are in China, in Brazil, in India, and then the GCC countries, Ma'aden in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE as well, coming up with various entities. And then the third set of actors that I want to talk about, very important, I think they're kind of eluding a lot of attention, is tech companies that are increasingly becoming vertically integrated. Your Teslas, your Googles, that want to get involved, and some cases are getting involved in mining and processing and refining. And I think all of those that landscape of actors, policymakers would have to kind of grapple with them. There could be a lot of opportunities for innovations, for ensuring that we mitigate risks for the whole of humanity, but there are also some risks and challenges associated with this new set of actors.
Okay, yeah, Dr. Yu Jie, you have the last word.
Sure, okay. Just regarding private-public partnership, I invite you to have a look on China's national public budget this year. Every single core items over there actually either declined or remained the same in line with inflation, except the fund regarding research and innovation increased around 12% in line with inflation. And where this 12% would go, and this 12% would actually make up to the funding to fund those private sectors where the Chinese government refer as the little giants that enable themselves to creating some sense of niche technology, some sense of cutting-edge technology that the rest of the world have not really discovered yet. And whether they will be able to succeed, we don't know. But at least I would say this is the first attempt that is very much a state-led economy and try to do something differently.
With that, we conclude the panel, and so thank for to the distinguished panelists for a very comprehensive discussion of various issues.
Thank you very much.